My name is Max Evans, and in this video, I'm going to introduce you to some of the key human factors that influence organizational knowledge sharing. I'm going to start by putting this really bold statement out there that effective organizational knowledge sharing promises many benefits both to the individual and the firm. Since hopefully nobody's going to argue with me about this statement, we could just say, sure, why not? I agree with you, Max. Now, understanding how to manage effective knowledge sharing behavior inside organizations is a much bigger problem. And KM research has traditionally approached this from two different perspectives. The first is really looking at technological enablers, or technologies, information systems that better facilitate organizational knowledge sharing. This was the primary focus from the beginning of KM research till about the mid to late 90s, when researchers and organizational theorists first started writing and thinking about how human and social enablers really played a role in organizational knowledge sharing. So really around the mid to late 90s, we made this shift over from first generation KM to what Mark McElroy called second generation KM, where he says something along the lines of, unlike first generation KM, in which technology always seems to provide the answer, second generation thinking is more inclusive of human resource and process initiatives. So really this is the area that interests me a lot for a number of reasons, mostly because knowledge sharing behaviors are highly complex social interactions, making them very tricky and difficult to manage. Also, people are much more likely to turn to colleagues rather than impersonal sources of information or knowledge like portals or information systems. Probably the most compelling reason is that tacit knowledge, of course, is not easily managed using technology. So for me, in my case, the phenomena of interest that really gets me is knowledge sharing among coworkers in professional service firms or knowledge-based firms where the primary service or product is knowledge-oriented. The driving question for my research has always been what makes someone share their knowledge with others at the organization or at the firm. To answer this question, it really started in my PhD, where I spent a good chunk of time looking at a literature review of anything I could possibly find as motivators or inhibitors of knowledge sharing. And ultimately, I came up with this really long list, but didn't really know how to organize the list or put the list into any categories until I came across a passage by Paul Duguid where he talks about whether somebody can or can't share and whether somebody will or won't share, which I actually thought was quite interesting, and divided my factors into two categories, one being ability factors, things we can or can't do, like maybe we don't share the domain that the knowledge comes from, or the shape or form of it is too tacit, or maybe network structures prevent us from having access to the knowledge. Other perspectives were really about whether somebody will or won't share, and really focuses on more of these human aspects like emotion or affect or ego or motivation. The interesting thing was, as I looked at all this research, I noticed one sort of underlining theme, and that was that trust played an important role with both ability factors and willingness factors. So I figured trust might be important here. Maybe I should restructure a research question around trust and saying what are the factors that influence knowledge sharing directly and indirectly through trust specifically. So this led to a second round literature review, which basically identified 14 factors that have been found to have a major effect on both trust and knowledge sharing, or on trust in a knowledge sharing context. Ultimately, a lot of these variables were combined, others were excluded because they posed some difficulty with our ability to record them or measure them or analyze them without somehow violating anonymity of the firm that we were going to conduct the study in. And ultimately, these 14 factors were reduced to only 5. The first of these being shared language and shared vision, which together we can consider a shared perspective, homophily, or a principle of similarity between two individuals, and we can measure homophily almost on anything. Our study really looked at some ascribed and acquired characteristics like age, gender, education. And then finally, tie strength and relationship length. We'll go ahead and start with shared language, which can be thought of as the extent to which the knowledge receiver and the knowledge source seem on the same wavelength. And what I mean by same wavelength really describes a situation in which the sender and receiver are able to easily understand, communicate, and agree with one another. Some people might call this technical grammar for communication. So prior research on shared language has really found positive connections between the similarity of coworker language and effectiveness in knowledge understanding and use. For example, shared language might be used as an important cultural tool needed in assisting any particular individual in drawing different distinctions within their own domain of practice. It's also critical for the transfer and integration of tacit knowledge, especially tacit knowledge that's rooted in the sharing of common frameworks like stories or analogies or metaphors. It's also going to have a positive impact on the likelihood of participating in knowledge sharing behavior because it facilitates different knowledge sharing behavior through a common understanding of how to act, as an ability to gain access to the right people for information, as an evaluation tool for the likely benefits of a possible knowledge exchange, as a common framework for combining different types of knowledge, and of course as a guide for how information is going to be interpreted and responded to. Research has also found an interesting differential effect on the quality and quantity of knowledge, suggesting that shared language is going to have a positive effect on the quality of knowledge shared, and really no empirical effect on the quantity of knowledge shared, which is actually quite interesting. Ultimately, of course, we could think of all of this as benefiting the overall team and firm performance. The next factor is shared vision. Shared vision can be thought of as the extent to which a knowledge source and receiver, in the eyes of the receiver specifically, share goals, concerns, and purpose. Shared vision really embodies the collective goals and aspirations of the members in an organization or in a group. And we can view a shared vision as kind of a bonding mechanism that helps different parts of the organization and different groups to integrate and to combine their resources. Knowledge, of course, is highly contextual and circumstantial, and it's always developed in a very specific context, and it's rarely interpreted in the exact same way as it was intended to by the transmitter of the knowledge. A key problem, of course, in representing the context in which knowledge is created and is relevant, knowledge, of course, is easier to transfer when it's rooted in a particular domain or a particular practice, and all the individuals involved or participating in the knowledge exchange belong to that particular domain or practice. Nonaka makes kind of a similar argument with respect to information, saying something along the lines of the mere transfer of information will often make little sense if it's abstracted from embedded emotions and nuanced contexts that are associated with the shared experiences. For knowledge to be shared, the receiver and the transmitter must share this contextual base, which Brown and Duguid called a shared framework for interpretation. Research in the area of shared vision has definitely found its positive effect on knowledge exchange. For example, shared vision helps workers see the potential value of the knowledge exchange and provides sort of a guideline for understanding which knowledge was worth acquiring and which knowledge is worth disseminating. It's also been found, shared vision has, as a necessary precondition for knowledge sharing, and it's had a positive effect on the overall willingness of a person to share knowledge, to share ideas, to share opinions, and of course to answer colleague questions when they're posed of them. Shared vision is also going to make it more likely for a person to participate in knowledge sharing and resource exchange activities. And when shared vision is high among coworkers, then the knowledge sharing process could actually tolerate some degree of inefficiency and still lead to positive outcomes. There was another piece of research, the one that looks at quality and quantity, that found shared vision to have a significant positive effect on the quality of knowledge shared again, but more interestingly, a significant negative effect on quantity. So really this finding is suggesting that having a higher shared vision encourages more succinct, meaningful exchanges between individuals. In network terms, homophily essentially implies that there's a positive relationship between the similarity of two coworkers and the strength of the tie or the relationship between them. So here I'm arguing and saying that the greater similarity between two coworkers would lead to a stronger relationship between them. McPherson, Smith-Levin, and Cook define homophily as the principle that contact between similar people occurs at a higher rate than among dissimilar people. So I might start by arguing that individuals of a similar age would be more likely to group together and to interact freely, for instance. Now, previous research has actually found, or organizational research has found, that there is such a positive relationship between age homophily and rate of contact, or between age compatibility and the likelihood of individuals or teams to engage in effective knowledge-sharing behavior or knowledge-sharing in general. Further, we can look at the opposite relationship and argue that the larger the age differences between two individual coworkers, then the more likely we are to suppress knowledge-sharing behavior. Other studies set in professional environments have looked at things like gender homophily or gender segregation. Ibera, for instance, found that gender homophily played a role in the inequality for access to professional interaction networks and to different knowledge sources and different knowledge content. OHA discovered a more compatible a person was with others in the group in terms of gender, the more likely they were to practice knowledge sharing. Previous research has also found individuals of similar education and experience are also more likely to form network ties or cooperative ties. And then greater differences, looking at the opposite side of this, greater differences in the levels of education, you'd see less likelihood to share. Other things that we might have looked at in our study and previous research has found has been ties between ethnicity, citizenship, marital status, etc. The next factor is tie strength, which can really be thought of as a combination between interaction and communication frequency and a feeling of closeness for a coworker. Originally, tie strength was really more about this idea of how often do you interact or communicate with a coworker, though recently they've realized that it's just as important to combine this feeling of closeness, so now it's really a combination, a measurement of both. In terms of research findings between tie strength and knowledge sharing, really there's two completely differing schools here who find exact opposite results. The initial results, the work of Granovetter, for instance, concluded that weak ties were more likely to act as a source of unique and useful information because your strong ties, the ties in your network that are strong, are likely to have the same or very similar information and information access to everyone else in your strong network. So essentially, the weak ties provided the opportunity to access new network ties as well as the potentially useful novel information that comes along with it. Weaker ties essentially reflected a path along which new information or novel insights were more likely to travel in comparison to the stronger ones. And these were beneficial sort of in the dissemination of information, the dissemination of technical advice, the diffusion of ideas. So these are the types of study results that have been found. Weak ties are also useful because for each of us, it's much less costly to maintain a weak tie than it is a strong tie. Now, the other side of the spectrum, other researchers have proposed sort of the opposite, the existence of a completely contrary relationship to the one I just mentioned. So, for instance, that strong ties are more important than weak, because these are the ties or these are the people that are more likely to make themselves accessible as well as are more likely and willing to help somebody in their network. There are numerous other studies that have confirmed a very similar claim by suggesting that strong ties are channels through which different useful knowledge flows and that these paths have greater knowledge exchange occurring within them, probably for this reason that people are more likely to help and are more accessible. For the most part, we would reason that both seem fairly reasonable and that both can be true. So one side, the benefit of weak ties, and the other side, the benefit of the strong ties, are more likely to expand this effort and to ensure that the knowledge seeker has sufficiently understood and can put into practice the new acquired knowledge. The last one of these factors that I want to talk about in this video is relationship length, which can essentially be defined simply as how long one coworker has known another. Basically, knowing someone for a longer period of time should theoretically lead to more knowledge sharing between the two coworkers, since it provides both individuals with ample opportunities to share and to learn each other's sharing patterns. However, very few research studies have actually been found that tested the direct relationship between relationship length and knowledge sharing. There are a few. There's a couple studies that looked at interpersonal relationships and knowledge sharing at European multinational corporations, both finding that relationship length did have a positive effect on knowledge sharing behavior. However, other researchers have sort of expanded the theoretical models by proposing a more complex relationship between knowledge sharing and relationship length, maybe one that's mediated through another factor, something like trust. And I'm going to leave it at that because there's going to be a separate video for trust. So please email me if you have any further questions or would like any of the references that I used in the presentation. Thank you very much.